Imagine this. You step into a long, dimly lit corridor. Behind you, a lock clicks shut, and you're now inside the most secretive archive in the world. Here lie letters from the Pope to Hitler, reports from the Inquisition, the execution order for Giordano Bruno, and, as some whisper, ancient grimoires, spell books filled with magical texts, rituals, and instructions for communicating with the otherworldly. Others claim even more. Documents so explosive they could upend Christianity itself, a gospel written by Satan, the hidden genealogy of Jesus, secrets of the end times. Myths? Almost certainly. But here's the thing, this archive really does contain millions of documents, stretched across 85 kilometers of underground shelves, and the vast majority are still off limits to ordinary people. This is the Vatican Archives, or as they were known until recently, the Secret Archives. To most of its contents, no one has access. Only in 2020 did the Pope order part of the archive to be declassified, giving historians their first glimpse into centuries of hidden documents. So what does the greatest archive of humanity actually contain? The story of the modern archive begins in the early 17th century. By then, the Vatican already held a vast collection of books and manuscripts. But in 1612, Pope Paul V officially created a separate archive, Archivum Secretum Vaticanum. The word secretum didn't mean secret back then. It meant private. This wasn't a state archive. It was the Pope's personal library. It didn't belong to the Vatican. It belonged to the Pope himself. When one died, the next inherited the vault, a place only he and a select group of specialists could enter. Since then, the archive has grown continuously. It holds papal bulls, correspondence with monarchs, denunciations, missionary reports, records of exorcisms, heresies, and scientific discoveries. Some are stored in underground bunkers with climate control, others in attics or locked safes. The texts are written in dozens of languages, from Latin and French to Armenian and Old Church Slavonic. Only a fraction of this priceless collection has been digitized to date. So, what can you find if you do gain access? The original interrogation transcripts of Galileo, a letter from Mary, Queen of Scots, to Pope Sixtus V, written just days before her execution. Henry VIII's formal request to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a refusal that triggered England's break from Rome and the birth of the Anglican Church. The trial documents of Giordano Bruno that led to his execution at the stake, and thousands of other documents remain sealed, especially those relating to 20th century popes. These are only opened 75 years after a pontiff's death. The first crack in the wall came in 1979. The renowned Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg wrote a letter to Pope John Paul II requesting access to the Inquisition's archives. There was no reply, and Ginzburg forgot about it. But 12 years later, in 1991, everything changed. A small group of researchers, including Ginzburg, was granted access to part of the Inquisition's materials. Ginzburg uncovered interrogation transcripts, previously unknown accounts of heretics, and most importantly, human stories, buried beneath the machinery of church authority. His work, including the famous The Cheese and the Worms, changed how history is told, not from the perspective of power, but through the eyes of the ordinary. In 1998, the archives were officially opened to qualified researchers. But getting in is still extremely difficult. You need a diploma, a doctoral degree, proof of active academic research, and, ideally, a recommendation from a respected institution. And even then, no more than 60 researchers are allowed in at once. Then, in 2018, something unexpected happened. Journalists were let in. Pope Francis did what no previous pope had done. He opened the archives not to scholars, but to the media. It was a gesture of goodwill and a direct response to pop culture. The reason? The film Angels and Demons, based on Dan Brown's novel, which portrayed the Vatican archive as a Gothic vault of forbidden secrets and dangerous truths. Francis wanted to debunk this myth. He wanted to show that the archive was not a labyrinth of darkness, but a modern research facility with catalogues, strict access rules, and climate-controlled systems. And so journalists were indeed allowed to walk the halls, see the digitized catalogues, and even glimpse a few manuscripts, but of course only carefully selected materials. The real secrets stayed behind locked doors. And yet, it is here that the Vatican keeps letters from the Pope to Adolf Hitler, and the records of Pope Pius XII, a figure still surrounded by fierce controversy. Some call him a savior of the Jews, others a silent accomplice to the Holocaust. In 2020, the Vatican declassified 180 boxes of material from the World War II era. And what did they reveal? The Pope knew. He knew about the deportations, the mass murders in Poland and Ukraine, but he never publicly condemned the Nazi regime. On September 27, 1942, an American diplomat handed the Vatican a secret report. 100,000 Jews killed near Warsaw, 50,000 in Lviv. The data came from the Jewish Agency in Geneva. Washington asked the Vatican to verify it, but the Holy See replied, "We could not confirm it." Yet by that time, the Vatican already had 2 other letters with the same information. One from Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, reporting the extermination of 200,000 Jews in Ukraine, and another from an Italian businessman Malvezzi about the killings in Warsaw. The information had reached the very top. Pius XII read the report, but his aide, Angelo Dell'Acqua, scribbled a note in the margin. Jews tend to exaggerate, and Eastern people are not exactly paragons of honesty. Why did the Pope remain silent? Some say he feared making things worse. Others that he chose diplomatic silence. We still don't have an answer. The archives are open, but the truth remains buried, and historians are still searching. So why does the Vatican archive continue to stir so much controversy? Because of its secrecy. An enormous vault, over 80 kilometers of shelves, still remains inaccessible to the public. Access is tightly restricted, and many documents remain under lock and key. This opacity fuels not just curiosity, but myths. And over the decades, the legends have piled up. Stories of the Gospel of Satan, allegedly found in the tomb of King Solomon, of ancient grimoires, books of spells and rituals said to have been personally hoarded by Mussolini, of artifacts with supernatural power, like the Spear of Longinus or the Holy Grail. No, none of these myths have been confirmed, but none have been disproven either. The Vatican has never officially declared that these items do not exist, and that silence only feeds speculation. To be clear, I personally doubt that the Gospel of Satan exists. But as long as there are sealed rooms and restricted corridors, the imagination of journalists, writers, and millions of their readers will continue to flourish. Where there's a locked door, there's always someone who wants to know what lies behind it, especially if the door is guarded by the Vatican, hence the endless stream of theories. In the show Ancient Aliens, they speculate that the Vatican holds evidence of extraterrestrial contact, dating back to the Renaissance. In the Da Vinci Code, it's hinted that the archive contains proof of Jesus' alternative bloodline. In The Lost Symbol by Dan Brown and elsewhere, there are references to documents that could supposedly rewrite religious and political history. Online forums speak of the Chronicles of the End Times, scrolls containing a detailed prophecy of the apocalypse, allegedly locked away forever. And in occult circles, there's talk of a Book of Shadows, assembled from fragments of pagan texts confiscated by the Inquisition. None of these have ever been verified, but the longer the Vatican remains silent, the louder the fantasies grow. And yet, even without the myths, the archive has the power to rewrite history, just as it did when scholars were granted access to the Inquisition records or the documents of Pius XII. For 2,000 years, the Catholic Church has shaped the course of global history, and every twist and turn has left its trace in the Vatican archives. In 2019, Pope Francis officially changed the archive's name. It's now called simply the Apostolic Archive, to avoid the confusion around the word secret. But the essence hasn't changed. Everything is still decided by the Pope: what to reveal, what to conceal, what humanity will learn in 100 years, and what it may never know. And that brings us to the question: are the Church, historians, and we ready for the full truth? Sure, the Galileo case is a fascinating historical episode, but what happens if we open everything related to the 20th and 21st centuries? The sexual abuse scandals shaking the Catholic Church, the Vatican's political entanglements? I suspect that one reason the archives remain so restricted is fear. Fear of compromising the Church in the eyes of the faithful. Personally, I've always believed it's better to face both the light and the shadow of history. But in this case, the final decision will be made by some future pope, and how he chooses, we do not know. And are we truly ready for the truth? If it turns out to be inconvenient not only for the Church, but for ourselves, if you could step into that archive, what document would you open first?